Okay, good morning and welcome everybody to the monthly Recovery Cafe volunteer training. My name is Brian. I'm the program manager of Recovery Cafe. This month we have Valerie and Patrick from NAMI, Jefferson County here to facilitate our training on mental health basics and communication skills. So I'm going to share just a couple things about Recovery Cafe and then I'll turn it over to them and I'll let them decide what we're doing for introductions today, if we have the time for it or not. So Recovery Cafe is a community of people who are in recovery from all of the above. That means addiction, mental health issues, homelessness, trauma. You know, an easier way to say it is everybody's in recovery from something, and we all need a community to help us recover. So here at the building at 939 Kearney Street, we are open on Thursdays from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. and we're serving a free meal during that period from 1:30 to 2:30. And then we're open again on Fridays for breakfast, actually right now, from 10 to noon. The expectation for being in the space is 24 hours drug and alcohol free and to practice our guiding principles, which are to connect with divine love in ourselves and others, to cultivate compassion, show respect, practice forgiveness, encourage growth, and give back. None of us are perfect, so all we are is we come here as ourselves in all of our strengths, gifts, talents, and imperfections. We're not here to fix anybody. We're just here to develop support for our recoveries, whatever that might look like. We would invite any of you guys, if you feel comfortable, to join us here any of those times. And we would love to welcome you into the space, give you a tour, tell you about the program. I got a reminder from Thais that if you are not speaking, to please mute yourself to diminish any background noise, which can be a bit distracting. So we do these monthly volunteer trainings to help us build skills for supporting our own and other people's recovery, to learn about what community resources exist, and to build our recovery community. In the last year plus, during the pandemic, this is what we have to build community. And the relationships and connections that we're building here are genuine and authentic. It's been beautiful to witness people who have only met each other through a screen on a little box like this, to then see each other here in person at the cafe. It is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So I think that's my song and dance at the beginning. I will turn it over to Patrick and Valerie. Thank you again so much for being here today.
Thank you,
Well,
Brian.
thank you, Brian. I'm going to start by letting everyone know that we're going to do a lot of share screen with the PowerPoint here. So you may not be able to see people's faces, but hopefully we can all hear each other talking. So I'm Valerie Phimister. I'm the past president of NAMI Jefferson County. I did that for about 6 years. And we are teaching the mental health basics and crisis communication skills because we were asked by members of the community, sometimes businesses, Chamber of Commerce, and so forth, to put together some kind of a workshop that would help us increase our skills, our communication skills, and get a better understanding of mental health conditions. So can you see this PowerPoint okay?
Mhm.
Looks great.
Patrick? Okay, good. That's working. Things don't always work. As you know, you're going to see some thumbnail talking heads over on the right-hand side. And if you move your cursor up to the black bar on the top, you can actually move that over to the right and read things better. So for those of you that don't know what NAMI is, it's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. It's the nation's largest grassroots mental health organization, actually started in a kitchen back in Virginia with parents and family members who had a loved one with mental illness. And since that time, they've developed a number of signature programs. The biggest ones, of course, are the support groups. We have support groups for people with their own diagnosis and for family members, caretakers, and friends. We do a lot of education, larger classes, smaller workshops, and we do a lot of advocacy. We have actually sent people to Congress before. We've sent people to Olympia every year on lobby day and lobby for legislation that can help the community through mental health issues. So why this workshop? We wanted to be able to help you know about types of mental illnesses and their symptoms, and to better understand the language of mental illness. And believe me, there is quite a language. There's a vocabulary and a lot of acronyms. So we're going to try not to use as many acronyms as possible today. And then we're also going to help us have a better communication skill when mental illness might be a factor. So a lot of people ask themselves, I have to keep moving this thing around, what is the prevalence of mental illness? And so the CDC and National Institute of Mental Health have put together this chart that tells you the prevalence of mental illness, and they have only listed the major disorders. And as you can see, anxiety disorder is at the top of the list. And that's probably even higher than that now, since we've been through over a year of this pandemic. And then you can see the different percentages as we go further down the list. And they ask us to remember that people are not their diagnosis. A person is not a schizophrenic. A person is someone who has schizophrenia. So we try to stick with that. So with that, we're going to move on, Patrick.
Oh, thank you, Val. Thank you, Val. And Brian, thank you. And thank you to all of you for being here. I see some names here of people that are part of our community, and we're delighted to have you. I'm also on the board of NAMI Jefferson County, and I'm trying very hard with no success to follow in Val's great big footsteps. That's no indication of what the size your feet are. It's merely a figure of speech, Val. And so we're very, very glad to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about mood disorders, and you can see the slide there on your screen, so we'll just refer to that. And the mood disorders are characterized by the person's mood, and we all have moods that go up and down, and some people's increase in moods or decrease in moods or feeling happy or feeling sad change radically. You'll see in parentheses there that moods come from moods are diagnosed by referring to the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and I know that some of you are familiar with that. And we are now in our 5th iteration of that. And Val had a number the other day that I found rather astonishing, that a few years ago there were, remind me, Val, of how many diagnoses there were in that?
The first version came out with 152 diagnoses. And now there are 365. We're not going to list 365 of them today and talk about all of them today.
So the increase in diagnosis reflects our understanding and our ability to research what's going on with people, and that's very helpful. I just want to spend just a few more moments on this. That's very helpful because what it does is enable a more precise diagnosis so that we understand the behavior, and that in turn allows the healthcare providers to give a more accurate prescription for medication if that is in order. Of course, anxiety, Val already mentioned in the prevalence slide just before this one, is a big one. We all have anxiety from time to time, and but there are many people who have anxiety at such a level that it impairs their ability to meet the daily tasks of living. We also have phobias, many phobias. There are, I'm sure that you know people, or you yourself may have some phobias, a fear of this, a fear of that, high anxiety around doing something. There's a broad range of phobias, and when it reaches the point where you're no longer able to function on a day-to-day basis, that creates all sorts of problems for you. So phobias are something that we talk about and something that we like to bring to people's attention. PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Most of us have heard about that in relationship primarily to veterans, but we have learned over the last few years, and research is incredibly important when it comes to mental illness. We have learned that post-traumatic stress syndrome is common to many, many people, and it can occur from things like adverse child events, an accident that you might be witness to, or one that you're in, a family experience of some kind that can be very, very disruptive. So you don't have to be a veteran, and you don't have to be in the military to experience post-traumatic stress syndrome. And we've learned also that it doesn't have to be what may appear a minor event. They can range from seemingly insignificant to very, very large traumatic events in your life. So we're learning more and more about that, and we're finding ways to address post-traumatic stress syndrome. Generalized anxiety disorder is something, again, I think that many of us have experienced. I have sort of a low-level anxiety disorder that's always there, that I take medication for to lessen that feeling. Most of us are familiar with obsessive compulsive disorder. One, for example, is a desire or almost an antibacteria kind of feeling. And it's, again, it can reach the point where the person is not able to function in day-to-day life, and can really interfere with attending to the daily tasks of living. Agoraphobia, fear of going outside. We are working with an individual now who has cloistered himself in his condominium and is so uncomfortable and so afraid that he won't go outside. And of course, that can really interfere with your daily life. And there are other ones too. Want to draw your attention to depression, and we're going over these rather quickly. And many of you, of course, have more in-depth knowledge of this with the education that you've accessed working with NAMI and others. But this is a mental health first aid class, so these are things to be aware of when you're in a situation where you might be with a person who is exhibiting symptoms of mental illness, and you want to be helpful. Major depression. Major depression is a big issue here in this country and around the world. One of the things that I want to hasten to add, and this may come a little bit later on in the presentation, but mental illness is not unique to a particular race, a particular gender. It crosses all ethnic groups, all racial groups, and the symptoms present themselves in a similar way across all groups of people. There's a persistent depressive order. The major depression can come and go, but then there's the persistent depressive disorder called dysthymia, and that's when you are in the depths of depression and you just don't seem to be able to shake it. Seasonal affective disorder, I think, is pretty common here in the peninsula. When we first moved here, somebody told us that on July 5th and 6th it would not rain. And but today we know that's not the case, and today is an absolutely beautiful day. It's good for all of us. But there is seasonal affective disorder. Many people also have lights that they place so that they can look into them during the course of the season, overcast, rain, and that sort of thing. And then there's psychotic depression, which may develop as a result of a traumatic event, for example. And then when a person is in psychosis, they can become manic. There are all manner of behaviors that develop as a result of a psychotic depression when they act out. You'll know people with depression who just can't seem to, their energy level is very, very slow, or very low rather. They have difficulty getting out of bed and so forth. If you have a psychotic episode of depression, you tend to be acting out. Postpartum depression, of course, is not uncommon with women who have given birth, and a lot of work's been done in that area too. And so hopefully obstetricians and others who are working with women, or caring for women rather, are paying attention to that. And we didn't realize how common that was until a few years ago. So again, another important way of identifying when a woman is experiencing postpartum depression. And then again, relating to women, the premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD, another acronym for you as well. And situational depression, we all have episodes where we go through a cycle of depression. It could be a family event. It could be any number of things. And that's common. They're oftentimes referred to as the blues. And people will cycle through those. It's when they don't cycle out of it that real problems develop. But you ought not dismiss situational depression, because that can become a very, very challenging issue. On the other hand, to recognize that it is a reality is also very important. Let's go on to the next one there, Val. And more symptoms of depression: sadness and loss of enjoyment. Some of these may be obvious, but they're important to pay attention to. And so if you are observing people that seem unduly sad, it might be something to give some thought to. Loss of enjoyment. I think this is one of the most insidious, if you will, of indicators of depression. You lose the ability to laugh. You lose the ability to enjoy events in life, the sunshine, for example, and you lose your energy, and you're tired all the time. Depressed people often sleep many, many hours a day beyond what we would usually expect. Now, it doesn't mean if you're sleeping and you like to sleep late in the morning that you have depression. But again, if you become aware of a friend or an acquaintance who seems to be sleeping an unusual amount, you might ask them about that. Feeling worthless or guilty, gosh, our level of self-esteem when we're depressed drops precipitously many, many times. And it doesn't matter what people say to us, or no matter how many affirmations we get, we continue to feel worthless, and we continue to feel guilty. And those two indicators are especially important when it comes to working with a person who we believe has a mental illness. And so, again, take note of that. Thinking about death, suicidal ideation can be an issue. We're going to talk about that just a little bit more later on. But people who are depressed believe that there's no way out, that it's not going to get better. They lose hope, and some of us have family members who have reached that situation, and sometimes they end up taking their own life. Difficulty concentrating is also an indicator of depression. I'm inspired here, if you will, I don't know if that's the word or not, to mention attention and deficit disorder. But when you're depressed, it is very difficult to concentrate. You may go from one thing to another. You may be trying to type something on your computer. You may be trying to read a book. If you're depressed, that's extraordinarily difficult to do. You might be facing a challenge when it comes to participating in a conversation with someone. And also of note, and you can readily see there, you move slowly, or you're easily agitated. People who have depression can sometimes react to the slightest thing that may be said to them, or the slightest experience. If you are going outside and you leave the door open, for example, that could really agitate you. Eating difficulties may seem obvious, but let me talk about it in just a moment. Depressed people often eat more. Depressed people often eat less. And then perhaps one of the most challenging parts of depression are sleeping difficulties. People who have depression, and again, I've experienced that over the years, are not able to fall asleep. They sleep too much. Their sleep is restless, and it's not very effective or refreshing sleep. And mood orders are continued, as you can see there. Bipolar, we hear a lot about bipolar.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk about this one because I have a daughter that suffers from bipolar 1, which is the manic version of bipolar disorder. And it's one of the major diagnoses, but it's where you have periods of depression and periods of mania. So some people, especially with bipolar 1, can have elevated mood and they feel good. They feel overconfident, grandiose, and then they begin losing sleep, which contributes to the condition because lack of sleep can actually cause a person to become delusional or psychotic. And so that's bipolar 1. Bipolar 2 is more on the depressive side. So what is psychosis? Psychosis is thoughts and emotions that are so impaired that contact is lost with external reality. They don't see the world in a very realistic way. So they can have psychotic depression. They can have psychotic mania. They can also have psychoaffective disorder, which is a mood disorder and schizophrenia. And then, of course, we all know that schizophrenia itself is manifested mostly by the psychosis. And sometimes psychosis can be drug-induced, and it can also produce possible aggressive behavior. But we have to be really careful when we talk about that, because the facts are that people who suffer from mental illness are more often victims of violence than they are perpetrators of violence. And that is researched, and we need to pay attention to that, because frequently when there's something like a mass shooting, the first thing people do is ask, is there mental illness involved? So we want to make sure we understand people are more often victims of violence than they are perpetrators. So Patrick, this next one is yours.
Oh, thank you, Val. Schizophrenia, we hear about that from time to time. And I'll just read what you see on the screen there. Breakdown, schizophrenia is evident when there's a breakdown in the relation between thought, emotion, and behavior, leading to a faulty perception, inappropriate actions and feelings, withdrawal from reality, and personal relationship into fantasy, delusion, and a sense of mental fragmentation. Schizophrenia is not real common, but it is certainly evident. And to illustrate that a bit more, you'll see that schizophrenia is people who have schizophrenia are oftentimes beset with delusions. They have hallucinations. We've all seen A Beautiful Mind, film in which Russell Crowe starred, and and that did a really good job of illustrating what one of the symptoms of schizophrenia, which is hallucinations, and sometimes imagining people that are not there, hearing voices. Many people with schizophrenia hear voices, and they continue. It can be very, very unsettling, as you can imagine. And there's a disorder of thinking and speech. If a person has schizophrenia, and they'll oftentimes say things in a very erratic sort of way, or say things that seem to come out of nowhere, impairing their ability to talk and be cogent, and their behavior becomes very disorganized. Now, a lot of us have disorganized behavior, but people with schizophrenia find that an acute manifestation of schizophrenia, if that's what their diagnosis is. And then, and this is one of the most dangerous and one of the most tragic aspects of schizophrenia and some other mental illnesses, which is people withdraw, and that's understandable. They simply are not able to cope with being out and among friends and among family and among others. And so that's something to really pay attention to. If you have a friend or a family member or know someone who seems to sort of disappear from what's going on. Apathy, not really caring about anything, not having an interest in anything. And then an emotional flatness. Their affect goes away. People who have otherwise been quite animated, been quite excited, who follow a conversation with its usual ups and downs, and that flattens out, and people may just sit there without any response to what's going on around them.
So now we're going to talk about personality disorders. We've been talking about mood disorders. Now we're talking about personality disorders. And that is the type of mental disorders in which someone has a rigid and unhealthy pattern of thinking, functioning, and behaving. And the biggest one is called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, and they have since changed that. But what it describes is someone with two or more distinct personality states. Sometimes people always want to refer to the 3 Faces of Eve, I think. That was a film that depicted that. And often the victims are, the people are victims of severe abuse, and they generally have gaps in memory. And because they're victims of severe abuse, they also exhibit PTSD symptoms. And they have a detachment from feelings and thoughts and actions. So they don't feel feelings the same way everyone else does, and they don't think things through the same way everyone else does. So that is DID, dissociative identity disorder. Another personality disorder is a little harder to put your finger on. It's called borderline personality disorder, but that includes fear of abandonment, having unstable relationships, being unclear or unstable with their self-image, being impulsive and self-destructive, and sometimes doing self-harm. They have extreme emotional swings and chronic feelings of emptiness, followed by explosive anger. The interesting thing about borderline personality disorder is that there is no medication for it. It is treated for the most part with something called dialectical behavioral therapy. So they learn different ways of behaving and responding to people, because borderline personality disorder really shows up in the relationships between people. And so that's why you see these unstable relationships.
Val, we do have a question about mania. Define mania.
So mania is a state, and this is my favorite way of describing it. It's like sitting in a car and having it in neutral and putting your foot on the gas, and the engine is running and running and running. You're not going anywhere, but it's running and running and running. And that's kind of what's happening to the brain in mania. It's running and running and running. And the people who suffer from this are kind of at a loss to be able to take their foot off the gas. So mania has to do with the speed at which the brain is thinking and processing things.
Well, thank you, Val. And if you do have a question and need clarification or a comment, don't hesitate to put that into the chat, and we'll try to monitor that.
Yeah, and we didn't say that at the beginning, but you can chat either to Patrick or I or everyone in the group. So you can put questions in there or comments in there. And by the way, since I'm the one sharing the screen, I cannot see any of the chats. So if Patrick or Brian want to jump in and tell us what those questions are, I would appreciate that.
Well, thank you, Val. And when we invite you to offer comments and observations, many of you are living with somebody or have lived with someone that has a mental illness, and your experience and your observations and your knowledge is very, very important. So we welcome your contributions as we go along in this very brief overview of mental illness. Let's turn then to substance abuse disorders. Many people who have a mental illness or oftentimes are also using substances, alcohol, drugs, prescription things, or prescriptions, pardon me. And a huge part of that, as we know, are opiates. They are prevalent in our life, and there's been a lot of information about overprescribing, and it's just a huge issue. And it becomes complicated when someone is using something like alcohol or an opiate or some other type of drug and has mental illness. There's a term for that called co-occurring disorders. And that leads me to mention that we now refer oftentimes to mental illness and substance abuse as behavioral health disorders. You'll hear that term a lot. And co-occurring disorders are important to recognize, because until a person reaches a point of stability with respect to their addiction and behavior associated with substance abuse, it's very difficult to get an accurate diagnosis and to prescribe the medication that person needs to address their mental illness. So therapists and others who are working with people who have a mental illness will stay alert to detect whether or to determine whether or not that person has a substance abuse disorder as well.
So we're heading towards the communication part of this workshop, which I think is probably the most useful for everyone. If we have a good understanding of what people are dealing with, that's one thing. The question is, how do we communicate and what kind of action do we come up with? So how do we deal with a mental health crisis? How do we communicate with people during a mental health crisis? And how do we respond to people who may be suicidal, which is incredibly important? And what are our best resources in a crisis? So those are some things that we're going to look at today. And when we first started doing this workshop, it was for business people. We did it at the Chamber of Commerce because they were asking us about information about how to handle people who came into, for example, the tourist center, and how could they respond to those people and how could they communicate with them, and what kind of skills they could use. So that's how this original workshop was geared. It was geared to people who work in the public sector and deal with the public on a regular basis. So the first thing that we're going to look at is our role in suicide prevention. And we do a separate workshop on this. And I think we're doing that in a couple of months with the Recovery Cafe. But we needed to put this in here for people so that they would have some kind of process to go through when they really believe or think that suicide might be an issue. So we used the LEARN acronym, which, by the way, was developed by the University of Washington social work department. And it follows this. L is for look for warning signs. And we've talked about warning signs before when we're talking about seeing if someone is affected by some sort of mental illness. But this is a warning sign, for example, people giving things away, their prized possessions, or collecting guns and hiding them in their bedroom closet or whatever. So looking for warning signs is the first thing to do. The second thing is to empathize and listen. And I can't emphasize that enough, because if we're not listening, they're not going to talk. The next thing is the critical piece of it. Ask about suicide. Ask if they're thinking about taking their own life, if they're thinking about harming themselves. And over the years, we've learned not to use the words commit suicide, because in the past, suicide actually used to be a crime, and you commit a crime. Now they realize it's the result of a mental condition. And so we like to say a person took his own life, not committed suicide. So do ask that question. And then be prepared for the answer, because the answer may be yes. And then what? So the next thing is to, one, remove the danger. So if you're in a position where you can remove the pills they've stockpiled in their bedroom, or the guns, or the ropes, or whatever, and then go to the next steps, which in most cases is connecting the person with some kind of professional help. So that, I think, is probably the first most important communication skill and action that a person can take, is to be on the alert for suicide. And if you follow this acronym, you can't be led in the wrong direction. You're going in the right direction. And it's okay to ask about suicide. A lot of people think if you ask about it, you're going to make them think about it, and then they'll want to do it. And that's been proven to be incorrect. So keep that in mind. It's important to ask. And a lot of times they will tell you up front whether they have considered it or not. So
I might just add, Val, that one way to ask that is, are you going to harm yourself?
mhm.
And that's an effective, non-threatening way to ask an individual if they're vulnerable or in a situation where they feel like they're going to harm themselves.
And in a lot of cases, when you look at that next steps down there, most of us are not professionals and we're not qualified to do therapy or prescribe or any of those other things that need to be done. So it's so important to be able to connect the person with someone who is qualified to do that. And that next steps part of it is, okay, if you get the answer yes, and you've removed them from the danger or removed the danger from them, now what do you do? How do you connect them? And who do you connect them with? And do you take them there? Do you accompany them? You know, all of those things are part of the next steps to help hand this person off to the professionals who can do their job. Now, I'm asking for comments or questions because I can't see the chat.
Oh, thank you to Katie. And the question is this, Val. But what do you say next if they say yes to the question about, are you going to harm yourself?
So that's one of the things we're going to talk about in the communication part of it when we do something called reflective response, to acknowledge that they are in pain and that they are at a state where things feel hopeless. So acknowledging that is so very important. It's like hearing what they're saying when they say, look, I'm thinking about taking my life. And, you know, I've been collecting pills for a couple of months now. You need to acknowledge that you realize that they must be in a great deal of pain to do that, or they must be at a point where they believe the situation is hopeless. And if you acknowledge that, then they can understand that you are actually listening and empathizing with them. So that is the first thing.
To keep that conversation going and that engagement in a non-threatening way. In the LEARN acronym, empathize and listen cannot be emphasized enough. We have another comment, and this is so true, and thank you for bringing this up, that it's incredibly difficult when a person is not willing to ask for help or to get help. That presents a particularly difficult kind of situation, excuse me, and we've all run into that with friends and family and others who we may be involved with that have a mental illness, and it is not an easy thing to address, and that leads to another issue, which is the denial in many people when it comes to mental illness, denial that they do have a mental illness. And so thank you for that observation. Not that comment, it's a very relevant comment and something that we often run into.
Sometimes there is a lead up to the A part, the asking about suicide. And that is, you know, I've been your friend for a long time. I really care about you and I'm concerned. Are you thinking about taking your own life? So you start that conversation and start that question with the recognition of the fact that I've been your friend for a long time and I really do care about you. And that's why I'm asking this question.
And great example of empathy, Val, and creating a safe environment to the extent that you can for that person to be forthcoming, and doing so without condemnation and telling that person, oh, snap out of it. Most of us know that that's not very helpful when to say that.
Okay, any other questions?
I'm checking here. No, not yet.
Okay, I'm going to move on to this one. Patrick?
Okay, this is for you, all of you, so pay attention. We're not sharing this information with you because we think you've been doing it all wrong. Most people have pretty good instincts, and those of you who are involved with the Recovery Cafe, for example, and others, are cognizant of a lot of this. So trust your instincts. You've been doing some really good things. You've been great friends when you gather together in a support group or at the Recovery Cafe or anywhere else. It's an indication that you want to learn more, but also our presence there helps other people. So this is not to say to you, do what we're going to share with you this morning because you've been doing it all wrong so far. That's not the case. So feel good about the friendship, feel good about the things that you do to help other people who have a mental illness or are going through a difficult period in their time. We're teaching this in part to give you a different perspective, and as you can see there, to help you develop more communication skills. Val emphasized this, and I will too. It's most often about communications, the ability to connect with a person who is in a vulnerable kind of position where mental illness might be a factor. So, and finally, I'm going to take you off the hook here. Don't blame yourself. And this is the mantra of NAMI. And quote, you can't know what no one has taught you. You can't know what you don't know. And that's something that we hasten to share with family members in particular who aren't quite sure what's going on with their family member, friends, or someone in their lives that is acting strangely. And that's where education comes in. That's where knowledge comes in. That's where understanding comes in. And so it's really important to not blame yourself if you are in a situation where you draw a blank and you say, what's going on here? And so NAMI, one of NAMI's principal objectives is education, and mental health basics is part of that. I want to talk a little bit about different sources of the four different sources of problem communication with people who have a mental illness or exhibiting signs of a mental illness. They are oftentimes overloaded. They have all sorts of things coming at them. Imagine that if you have schizophrenia, for example, and you're hearing voices in your head, that can be overwhelming, and that is very real for those of us who have not, who don't have schizophrenia. It can be just. It's hard to imagine what that's like to have that ongoing babble of noises in your head. Another issue too is hypersensitivity to noise and confusion. Many of us know people that have schizophrenia, and when they find themselves in a situation, let's say that they go into a store or a supermarket or something of that sort, or they're in a crowd, they are acutely sensitive, hypersensitive, if you will, to noise and confusion. I think most of us are, unless you go to a rock concert and you're in the mosh pit right at the front near the stage. But most of us have some sensitivity to noise and confusion, but that is radically exacerbated when a person has a mental illness or is experiencing symptoms of mental illness, and people will become confused, and they'll be oftentimes will reach a point where they it triggers some kind of event that I might suggest psychosis. And then there's a rush of fragmented thoughts too. People are not able to think in a linear kind of fashion. It's tough and difficult and sometimes impossible to get from point A to point B. Your thought process is all over the place. And finally, our internal fears about what's going to happen, what's going on. I don't understand this. This is I'm very fearful of this. There is an absolute plethora or flood of internal fears that sometimes we experience, some of us experience from time to time. But when you have a mental illness, that flood of internal fears becomes absolutely overwhelming, and we become incapable of dealing with it, which is understandable. And when you have a mental illness, we're especially in a vulnerable place, and all the things that you see there, the 1, 2, 3, and 4 there, become exponentially greater when a person has a mental illness. And also want to draw your attention to some things that may be obvious, but nevertheless they bear repeating. An inability to focus on something, to keep your attention on something, not to be confused with attention deficit disorder necessarily, which is on the spectrum. That's in the DSM. But we have people who are going through a manic episode, or people who are experiencing behaviors associated with mental illness have a hard time focusing. It's very, very challenging for people to do that. And then also our memories will leave us. We're not able to keep track of things that have happened sometimes a while ago and sometimes just in the last moment. So if you are in a situation where you're having a conversation with somebody and it seems like they're having difficulty with remembering what was said right before, it doesn't mean that they have a mental illness, but it's something to pay attention to. Of course, now we know that many people tragically and unfortunately also experience dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and but people who have a mental illness absent those two conditions oftentimes experience issues with short and long-term memory. And then I'll use an example just to comment on information processing. I have a friend who experiences depression. He takes medication for depression, which works pretty well. But I remember going to a baseball game with him, and he was going to go up and buy the tickets to go to the game, and so he did. And when he got there, the teller at the ticket office was explaining to my friend where the seats were and that sort of thing. And he was not able to absorb that information because of his mental illness. And I happened to be standing next to him. And so I was able to help clarify what was going on. And that leads me to say one other thing too, is that he was profoundly embarrassed by not being able to negotiate that situation. And it was no fault of his, because his depression was at a point where sometimes processing what appeared to be logical kinds of pieces of information had just abandoned him. And we'll be talking about interventions a little bit more this morning, but doing that in a gentle, helpful sort of way so it doesn't embarrass that person is very important. But disjointed thinking, a loss of memory, and an inability to focus can sometimes, and let me emphasize sometimes, be an indication of mental illness. And I think many of us have been involved with people who exhibit some of these symptoms.
So we're going to take a look at what people normally do when they're in a social situation and what kinds of things people would regularly say. For example, in a business, you would say, "Hi, I'm so-and-so, what is your name?" Or, "Is there something in particular I can help you with?" if they walk into your store. Or, "I'm sorry, we're about to close up. Is there anything else we can do for you before we close?" Or, "I'm sorry, we're not able to take care of that for you, but I suggest trying the city hall, or, trying the city council," or whatever. So we have all of these statements that we normally make in a social situation or a business situation that just kind of automatically come out of our mouths, especially if we've been working in that business for quite some time. We normally do that. Well, that doesn't happen when a mental illness becomes the issue. The whole conversation changes. So here are some things to keep in mind when we think about communicating with people in a difficult situation. We find that when that mental illness is an issue, it is a difficult situation.
Mm-hmm.
Best things that we can do are to keep short, clear, and direct sentences the order of the day. Very short, very clear, and direct. If it gets too complicated, they may not understand. And keep the message simple. Finally, if we look at the other things, keep the stimulation low. And Patrick talked about people that have suffered from a mental illness may have a difficulty being in crowds or in noisy areas. So sometimes it's good to keep the stimulation low. I remember I spent many years, decades, in fact, in the school system. And one of the things that we were very careful to do if we had students that had ADD or ADHD or whatever was not make the classroom too busy because it was too much stimulation. Well, this is the same kind of situation. A lot of times when you go into a business, you'll hear music, the kind of music that would be played for the generation of customers they're hoping to have in that store. And so sometimes that stimulation makes it very difficult for people to focus on the reason they went to the store. Also, be patient, but you can say that for anyone. And finally, don't waffle. That is, if you set a boundary, we're going to close at 9 and you have to leave. Don't waffle about that. Don't say, well, okay, I'll let you stay 10 minutes longer. You know, you can't waffle because then they're going to be confused. The boundaries are blurred. So those are things to keep in mind. And, you know, those are good things to keep in mind in a regular situation as well. It doesn't have to be a situation where someone may have a mental illness or may be affected by mental illness. Let's see, I'm on 21, 22. So there is another thing that we talk about, and that is logistics, the placement of things. If someone is agitated or upset, don't corner the person. And by the way, don't get cornered yourself. Keep a safe distance and remember that people have personal space. If you're within a foot of their face, that's too close. Very few cultures tolerate personal space that close. Sometimes it's good to stand to the side rather than to confront someone head on. And then, of course, using a calm voice without pointing at the person. And then think about inviting the person outdoors if what's going on inside is just too much to handle. So if there's a lot of chaos going on inside, too much noise, people hollering at the top of their lungs and music, and, you know, I invite them to go outside. You know, maybe it'd be easier for us to talk if we go outside. So those are some of the logistical things that you can do. And as you can see, this was geared for people who are working in a business situation. So any questions about this so far?
Valerie, I saw a question in the chat, which was, is ADHD and such considered a mental illness?
Yes, it's in the DSM.
It isn't.
It's so what's hard for people to understand is that when you say mental illness, you think something that could possibly put you in a mental institution. That's what people think in their heads. So when you talk about anxiety, well, you're not going to a mental institution for anxiety. And a huge percentage of the population has that. But now we're talking about brain disorders. So ADD and ADHD, which are in the process of being renamed, fall into that category. And so we don't want to be going to the school and saying, well, I have 3 kids in my class with a mental illness. Because that label, it makes things difficult and it stigmatizes people. So while yes, you'll find things like that in the DSM, they are diagnoses. And the reason they're in the DSM is that your insurance won't pay unless the doctor puts the right numbers in there. And the numbers come from the DSM, the diagnostic manual that they use to diagnose things. It's just like the manuals they use to diagnose cancer or diabetes or anything else. If they don't put those numbers on the paperwork, the insurance is not going to pay. So, yeah.
I just wanted to add also, Val, we've talked about this, but I want to reemphasize that by being able to identify the particular mental illness that a person is experiencing enables healthcare providers to prescribe the appropriate medication. Now, not everybody that has a mental illness needs to take medication, but there have been incredibly important advances in psychotropic medications that can really help people. One of the real challenges, of course, is getting an appropriate diagnosis and then giving prescribing an appropriate regimen of medication. So by honing in on what the specific mental illness is, by using a list of symptoms, we're able to specifically provide, or excuse me, give a regimen of medication coupled oftentimes with talk therapy as well. Val, before we go too far, and Brian sees this as well, we have a comment from Beth to the extent that when a person is and we talk with the person about whether or not they're going to harm themselves, they're oftentimes expressing loneliness, and so spending time with that person within the context of a loving presence will help them make their way through that danger. And Beth, thank you for those words. That really sets up a construct and a context that we can use to help a person who is in a vulnerable kind of situation.
And it also points up, I'm glad you brought that up, because it points up this whole concept of people backing away from the conversation when mental illness is an issue. And I, for example, used this to explain to people what it's like. So you meet your neighbor on the street and say something like, you know, I just came from the doctors and I got diagnosed with diabetes. And they'll probably say something, you know what, my mother had that and she took insulin for a long time and blah, blah, blah. So there's a conversation going on there. But if you meet up with that neighbor on the street and you say, you know, I just got diagnosed with schizophrenia, they're likely to just back away because they have absolutely no idea what kind of a conversation to have. And some still have that feeling that if they're too close, they might get tainted with whatever it is you have. So it's like mental illness is not catchy. So what we're trying to do is to learn better ways to communicate and to have that relationship. Stay with that person, have a conversation. If asking questions is the only thing you can do, that's the best thing that you can do, because at least you're having a conversation, you're staying with that person, and you're showing that you care. There's that listen and empathize thing going on there. So thank you for mentioning that. So, okay, now we're moving on to some of the communication skills here, Patrick.
Yes, Val, thank you. We had talked about taking a break here. We've got some other things to do. Do people need just a moment to catch their breath? We've given you a lot of information very, very quickly here. So I can't see all of you. So let's just assume that you do. And let's take just a couple of minutes.
I'm going to stop sharing this, and there we all are.
Okay, everybody okay with that? Then we'll come right back. Okay, okay, good.
All right.
So Brian, did you have to leave?
I left and came back already, believe it or not.
Oh, great.
But I will pause the recording and then Patrick say the word and I'll resume it again, okay?
Okay, great. Let's come back at it in about 5 minutes.
And I think you were gone when Cecilia asked the question about, can you ask that question again, Cecilia?
Yes, I was just wondering, because of the descriptions given that keep things in mind and the regular statements with those two sides, how are we supposed to address people coming into the Recovery Cafe? Should we be, vibrant, welcoming like we usually are? Or, it's just do we say anything or just look to see what they're going to do?
Great question. Thank you for asking. I'll first say that as a volunteer at the Recovery Cafe, you are always supported by staff. So you don't have to navigate anything that you feel uncomfortable navigating. You can always pull someone, myself or my colleagues, into a conversation for some backup, for some help, okay? To answer your question though, how to address something like that, I would say often it depends. It depends on a lot of different things. One approach that I like to use is to try to mirror the person. I try to mirror their energy level, their body language, and their level of speaking voice, the speed at which they're speaking, right? This communicates to that person, I'm here with you. I'm on the same page, I'm listening, right? And then we use some of our active listening skills, which is reflecting what we're hearing from them, summarizing. We can put it into our own words. Sometimes we can read between the lines of what they're saying. If they're talking about, I've got this going on, this going on, this going on, we can say, that sounds stressful. That sounds overwhelming. That sounds hard. That sounds difficult, right? And then if it is someone who is experiencing suicidal thoughts, just like Patrick and Valerie have already offered here, and we will have a workshop on suicide prevention and intervention in June. That's June 18th, as part of one of our Recovery Cafe volunteer trainings. NAMI, Patrick and Val will come back again for that. But to just address it really briefly here, we do ask those questions, right? We ask, are you thinking about killing yourself? And if they say yes to that, then we ask, have you thought about how you might do that? We ask about means. So then we know how imminent is the risk that this person will follow through. How far have they gone down this route of planning this thing out? This is a time that I would say definitely get some staff help, right? And we can come in and pick up that conversation. If you're not yet comfortable asking something direct like that, I'm not going to ask you to do that, right? Does that help?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Very well.
And we're actually just getting ready to launch into that communication part of it, where we'll be doing some of the things that Brian was talking about there. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to start with the I statements. So let us go back to here. Oh, now do you see it really big, or do you see the thumbnails?
I'll respond, Val. I'm not sure what we mean by big. I can see the thumbnails. Bill and I had a 4-hour discussion about thumbnails last night. But the screen isn't, the slide is not covering my entire screen, if that's what you mean, Val.
Oh, it was
Okay.
me, actually. It looked good to me.
Yeah, it was fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, that was page 1. Now I have to go back to where we were. Okay.
there we go.
There we are.
Okay, thank you, Sydney. Sydney is one of our board members, has been a stalwart member of NAMI for a long time, which provides an opportunity for me to invite you to become members of NAMI. If you would like, we would welcome your support. We have a really minimal fee. You can become a member for $5, for example, and that's important because it helps support our not the money, but your involvement helps us support our work and gets others involved in the process. And so we're always looking for people to be part of our support groups. We're always looking for people to serve on our board, for that matter. And so if that's, if you have an interest in that, don't hesitate to contact us. And it's important to have strength. There's strength in numbers when we go to the legislature or go to Congress, and so there are more of us that are, the more of us that are formally registered, the better it is. But there are lots of people out there, of course, that don't belong to NAMI that are doing great things. The Recovery Cafe is a very good example of that. So let's pick up on what Brian introduced already about I statements, and they have to do is with things like, when do you say, I feel, I think, I understand? That must be difficult. And here are some examples. We want to use I statement followed by a specific request. For example, I statements quite literally mean I statements that said, I feel this way when, rather than you make me feel, and whatever it is they are making you feel, whether you're fearful or nervous or sort of made to feel really that the person's behavior is really making you feel uncomfortable. But you don't want to put that back on the person, because it puts you in a position where you're making assumptions about that person's thoughts and intentions. And we can do some inquisitive kinds of things in a very gentle sort of way, as Brian was saying about asking a person if they feel suicidal, or asking a person if they're going to harm themselves. But that is getting actual information. But we don't want to make assumptions about that person's behavior or what their intentions are. So I have a couple of scenarios here, and if you're inclined to, we'll ask you to put a response into the chat there, and then we'll share those with others. And we'll give you a minute to do that. Let's see if I can find one that is.
Well, the scenario is right on the screen, Patrick, and what we're asking for
Okay,
is
thanks, Val.
for you to make an I statement if this were happening in your place of business. Come up with an I statement that works for this scenario.
And I think all of us have been in situations where we've been around, or most often, especially for downtown, where a person comes in and they are yelling in the place of business, and you happen to be in there. What is an I statement that you would perhaps put forth?
Now I'm going to shut this down so I can look at these too. So Brian, can you read what's in the chat?
Yep, so I see one from Haley that says, "I'm listening. How can I help?"
That's good. That she immediately took everything on herself. I'm listening. How can I help?
That reminds me of humor is sometimes helpful, though I'll try to make us laugh. That reminds me of Fraser Crane on forgotten the name of the show, where he's the psychologist and he says, "I'm listening." You know, not a bad thing to say.
I see one from Kathy, which says, "I see you're upset. I'd like to help if I can."
Yeah.
There's another one from John that says, "Is there something wrong? Can I help you with it?"
Mm-hmm.
So I see a link here somewhere.
Yes, Beth just posted that, and it looks like it's a website for nonviolent communication. It's a great resource. Thank you so much for sharing that, Beth. So if anyone has the opportunity now to click on that, and I can also share that out in email after the training.
So the whole point here is to not put pressure on the individual, to invite communication, and by beginning some kind of dialogue without causing the person to become even more upset. Do we have another scenario there, Val?
Hang on, before we leave this one, there is another direction that you can go and say, for example, "I find it really difficult to communicate with you. Could you," and then here comes the request, "could you lower your voice?"
Mm-hmm.
So for example, on the previous slide, navigating here, it says use an I statement followed by a specific request. Can you lower your voice? You know, I find it difficult to hear what you're saying. Can you lower your voice? So it's all on you. I'm the one that finds it difficult. I'm not saying you make me feel whatever. So the next scenario.
I might just share another one as we're going along here, Val. Smoking is, of course, is prohibited in public places, and sometimes people will come in and they will light up, and I've been in that situation, and what I try to say is, I don't think we can smoke in this environment, or being affirmative and taking the responsibility on yourself and not pointing specifically at that individual.
So our rules are, or blame it on the city. The city won't allow any smoking in the stores or whatever.
This is a strategy that I use very frequently, actually, is I appeal to an authority outside of myself, or to expectations that we have set up ahead of time. So we call that front loading. right? So an
Mhm.
example here at Recovery Cafe, every day when we're open, we do our announcements where we share about the guiding principles I said at the beginning of the training, right? So when we're observing somebody who's not meeting those guidelines, that's what we get to call people in for some accountability, some loving accountability is what we'd call it, right? I really liked what Beth had shared, and so I'll use this as the example, which it's first sharing your observation, then your feelings, then your needs. So in the case of someone tapping their pencil loudly here at Recovery Cafe, we could simply just say, "Hi, I noticed you're tapping your pencil there, and I'm feeling a little anxious about it. Actually, the noise causes anxiety for me, and I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind stopping tapping your pencil, and we can sit here and enjoy each other's company." What I could do is bring us back to the guiding principle of cultivating compassion and showing respect for other people, right? So, and this is a very simple one, right? But we could go back to the one where somebody is shouting as the example, where we could say to somebody, "Hey, I noticed that you're speaking loudly. I noticed that you seem upset right now. I'm feeling a little unsafe when I hear someone shouting in the space here. Can we lower our voice, please? Because everybody wants to feel safe in the space here."
Oh, Brian, those are right on the mark and very eloquent and a very good way to express an I statement. And the whole essence here is not to make not to aggravate the situation, not to make that person even more uncomfortable than they already are. But it does not mean when a person is engaged in a behavior that is unacceptable or not not in keeping with the environment that we're in, that they should be allowed to continue that behavior. I think oftentimes we're reluctant to intervene for fear of what that person's reaction will be. But people can still take responsibility for their actions and their behaviors with a bit of very gentle, thoughtful, I feel this way kinds of interventions, and people most often will respond to that affirmatively, and they and in some cases I think they even welcome the opportunity to engage in some kind of discussion. And then Brian said something else that's extremely important, which is to afford that person their dignity. We don't want to take away people's dignity, and we want to show them respect. And for people that are already feeling down and out and may have no sense of self-worth.
I see a chat here from, and I'm going to ask you to help me pronounce your name. Is it Theus or Theus?
Thais.
Thais,
Hi.
okay.
Thais, yeah. Thank you.
Well, you followed this exactly in your response. You said, "I find it hard to focus with the tapping noise. Could you please stop?" So first you made the I statement, and then you followed it with a request, which is perfect. All in one sentence, direct and to the point, very simple. You did your I statement, and then you made your request. So that's classic.
I also love the part of the focus for me here, right, is separating the person from the behavior. We don't need to, because the person's tapping or because they're shouting, to say you are disrespectful or you are there's something, I don't know, judgmental about them, right? It's not about that. It is about the behavior. And if we're able to separate those two things, that also doesn't make it then an interpersonal conflict between myself and them. It's very simple. We can change behavior, right? Well, I can't change who I am. So if you come and attack me, who I am as a person, I'm automatically going to become defensive, and that's going to escalate the conflict. And Elizabeth says, what if they don't change their behavior?
Yeah, this is for you, Brian.
Yeah, so in the Recovery Cafe space, that is for staff to manage. One thing that I found to be effective is usually people don't want to be in a space where they're not welcome any longer, basically. So what I'll say is we always welcome people back to the cafe. There may be some times where their behavior that day makes it so that they're not a good fit to be here. So I will actually let that person know, hey, it seems like we're having a hard time today. Why don't you come back tomorrow? And we would love to have you then. And then I start walking toward the door, and 9 times out of 10, they follow me right out the door. And then we've made an invitation. The person may not always remember the exact words that were used, but they will remember how we made them feel while they were here. So we want to make sure that they know they can come back. We don't have strings attached. I'm not going to shame them. We might want to talk about it later. So like, what is the opportunity for growth and connection with that situation that we can talk about later when everyone's back down on baseline? But sometimes some people's behavior is going to make it so that we can't be here today. So we make an invitation to come back tomorrow.
So there's another one here, which is actually a completely different approach from Kathy. It says, would it be appropriate to say, I see you're tapping your pencil. When I do that, I'm upset or worried about something. Would you like to talk? So there is an invitation there to have a conversation that might be related to the frustration that's going on or the anxiety that's going on or whatever.
I love that. That's great, Kathy. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's a thoughtful response.
So that takes care of that one. Let's move to.
I did, Valerie, just real quick. I can't believe we've already gotten to 11:30. I would like to keep this space. I think we're getting close to the end of the slideshow. I just want to say, for those who have only scheduled their time to be with us until now, I just wanted to acknowledge that's what time it is. But I'd love to get to the rest of these slides if the rest of you are willing to bear with us here.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Brian. So the second communication skill that we're going to talk about today is reflective response. And Brian has already mentioned this. It's like mirroring back to them what you're hearing them saying. So you focus on the person's experience. Remember, it's not about you, it's about them, what they're experiencing. And reflect the person's perception back to them with concern. So don't try to argue with their feelings or perceptions, because what they're feeling, what they're perceiving is real for them. So let's try some of these. And I have to say, in a lot of cases, people will say, it sounds like you're feeling rah, 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 which is fine, because you're checking with them. Is this really what you're feeling? Is this what you're saying? So a scenario here is someone says, they're always telling me to go someplace else. What kind of reflective responses could you have for someone who says that? I can picture this situation that Brian said where he walks out and the person follows them. Yeah, you're always telling me to go someplace else. So let's see what kind of responses people can come up with. Thanks for being here, Beth. I know you're leaving.
So I might offer one, if that's okay.
Sure.
A phrase that I'll often go to is, that sounds ... So if I just try to put myself in their position, if someone was always telling me to go somewhere else, that would not feel very good, wouldn't it? I would feel abandoned. I would feel frustrated. I'd feel angry, right? So I can reflect any of those. And Thais just said, yes, frustrating. And here for Kathy, frustrated and abandoned. Thais, definitely. That sounds really frustrating. I would not feel good if that's the experience I had as well.
Or, yeah, something as simple as that must be very hard.
So another scenario here is toggling back and forth. Someone is pacing back and forth nervously. Okay, they're not saying anything. It's their behavior that you're going to respond to. What could you say?
Thais had offered something. She said, "Hello there, can I get you something to drink?"
Mhm.
Okay.
And
Again,
another chat was, "Is there something you'd like?" Another, oh, hi Kathy.
yeah, non-confrontational is one of the keys here.
I like that one of making an offer of,
Mhm.
yeah, is there something that I can give to you? That would work in this space for sure.
Mhm.
May I get you a cup of coffee or anything? Coffee is such a great mediator. Just that expression, it's a euphemism for all manner of things.
Yeah. Okay, so everybody kind of get that reflective response. So now we're going to move to just some basic listening skills. Oh, it's another acronym.
Okay, this is a way of putting in a rather concise fashion here what we've just been doing, and LEAP is quite useful. Listening, we've talked about that. We practiced that a little bit. Empathize, and that's so critical important. And my sense is that everyone who's participating today has that capacity to empathize, to put ourselves in that person's position to the extent that we're able to and agree. Yeah, that's hard. That's really, really hard. And being empathetic will enable us to get to a point where we can acknowledge that it's just a hard situation. People with a mental illness are just in tough situations. It's very difficult to have a mental illness, and that extends, of course, to family and friends and others. But we often say in NAMI that people who have a mental illness are very brave in many ways to be able to make their way through life with a mental illness and hopefully receive an appropriate treatment and medication along the way. Then finally, the fourth letter there in that acronym LEAP is to partner. Join them, help them, and Brian has made this point very well, to at the Recovery Cafe to make staff aware that a situation is going on, to invite a friend or someone else to be part of that, to develop a partnership. And I would dare say that in some ways, that partnership also extends to the person who is in that situation. We're not in a situation where we want to put that person off. We want to help them make their way through the situation or whatever's going on in a way where they feel safe and they don't feel like they're being or where they don't feel like they're being forced to go away.
One thing I wanted to offer here real quick, which is something that Valerie touched on earlier, but I think bears repeating, which is to validate the feeling. So what we want to do is we validate the valid, which is our feelings. Our feelings are always valid. We validate the valid, but we do not validate the invalid. Sometimes we will have people who come here who they may have delusions, or they may see the world in a different way, right? And what we don't want to do is get sucked into those things, right? We'll have someone who is saying, well, this person's out to get me, or that person has bugged my phone, or whatever, right? Like it can go all over the place, right? But what we do is we focus on how would that make someone feel, okay? I don't want to get into a disagreement over, is that a delusion? Is it not a delusion? This person sounds like maybe they do need some additional mental health support than we can provide here. We are not a mental health treatment agency. We are a peer support program. So I would like us to very much stay in our lane here, right? But what we do is we greet that person with where they're at right then, which is, that sounds scary. And how can we support you through this? Would you like any additional services? Can we talk to you about what else is available? Does that make sense?
And Brian, another way of saying, or another thing for us to think about is, don't deny that person's feelings by trying to dismiss them or tell them that they're really weird, or that can't happen. Don't deny their feelings, because those feelings are their reality. That's what's going on with them.
And if they're hearing voices, those voices are real. to them.
Mhm.
So that's why it's important to agree. I mean, you can't say to them, well, there are no other voices in here. No one's talking, you know, or you shouldn't feel that way. That's a big no-no.
Yes, it's
So-
true for them. It is true for them.
It is very true for them and very real for them. So now we're going to talk about the very last part here. What about getting help? And some people asked that question earlier. There is 911, and I think what I'm going to change this slide and put the crisis number on there as well. There may be, if you're a family member, you may already have a safety plan. In our family to family class, we teach families how to put together a safety plan if a crisis does happen. There might be a long-term solution with the police. They may have, they may know this person and understand what the situation is, and then they know what contact to make. They may contact the navigator, they might contact the DCR, who is the designated crisis responder person who comes from the mental health agency. A lot of things can happen. But one thing you want to do is be able to protect other customers and call off customer intervention. If other customers see that you're in a crisis situation and they converge on you, it creates more chaos and more stress in the situation. So don't ask them not to help right now. And then there is a possibility of locking up the store. You may have to do that. You may have to get out of the building. You don't know what is possible. There are things like signals to coworkers, like Brian was talking about. The staff is there to support you. So for example, at the Chamber of Commerce office and the tourist center there, they have a phrase that is this: Sharon, would you get me the red folder? And that means I'm in a crisis situation here, and they do whatever it is that they have planned to do. So there could be those kinds of signals that can go to your coworkers or staff. Sometimes you can ask if another person can join us. For example, you're talking with this person and ask them, you know, is it okay if Brian joins us as part of this conversation? So ask, don't just automatically go for it. And then this is important, especially if you're working in a business place. Tie in with the next shift. Who's coming on next? What happened, so that they know what went on yesterday or earlier this morning or whatever. And then there is something called a debriefing plan. Debriefing is usually, I mean, they used to use it when there was a mass shooting or a big fire or an earthquake or whatever, and the emergency people would get together and have a debriefing plan. But the same thing happens in the workplace. So a debriefing plan helps people deal with emotions from any kind of an event. And it's not always a one-time thing. You may need to do follow-ups when you debrief. And you may consider professional help. So here's a good example. We had a board member a few years back whose daughter took her own life. And we knew the board member, we knew the story about her daughter. We were kind of close to this situation, and it was such a shock to everyone that we needed to be able to sit down as a group and debrief. We had a special debriefing where DBH came in and helped us. They had counselors who came in and talked with all the board members, and counselors who came in and talked with all the people who had been to our support group and knew her and her situation well. So consider professional help. I know that DBH is Discovery Behavioral Health. That's our county agency, mental health agency. And they are very willing to help a group debrief.
Well, thank you, Val, and thank you for all of your comments and your questions. We've gone beyond our time here, so also thank you for your questions. And Brian, I'm just curious, are the you're a social worker, and the things that you offered are profoundly important, and I really like the language that you used and helpful. Now, are those things that you share in your volunteer training in part, Brian?
Yes. So we have our monthly volunteer trainings, of course, which you guys have helped facilitate today. And these are things that we try to impart when we do those trainings, but also when we do volunteer orientations with here at the space. It's part of this kind of just ongoing language internalization, let's call it, right? It starts with our values around social justice and then internalizing that approach.
Okay, and when is your next volunteer training, Brian?
Thank you. Every month, it is the third Fridays. So next month it is May 21st, Friday, May 21st. And the topic is behavior change. It'll be taught by Craig Eisenberg, who is a therapist in private practice here in Port Townsend. He has experience with marriage and family therapy, also working with young people. And he is the former clinical director at Grey Wolf Lodge, which is now Newport Academy. So that's young men substance use disorder treatment. Craig is really knowledgeable, and I'm really excited about his talk. And then 2 months from now, we will have NAMI JeffCo come back for our workshop on suicide prevention and intervention. And that is Friday, June 18th, same time. We'll be continuing to do these on Zoom until further notice.
Right. Which reminds me that we're going to add another diagnosis to the DSM, and that's Zoomitis or something of that sort. Zoom has its advantages, but I think being in person, there's no real substitute for that. So, well, I think we'll end it there today with much thanks to all of you, and thank you to Brian for hosting us. And again, an invitation to become involved in NAMI if you wish. We have support groups, and we do offer a family-to-family class usually once a year. And that's available to family members and others who have a significant person in their life who has a mental illness. And I think that is probably it.
Real quick,
yes,
Jill, yes.
We have a question. Are you waving goodbye, Jill?
No.
Oh, you have
No.
a question.
There was an 888 crisis number that I didn't have a chance to write
Okay,
down.
we can put
Yes.
that back up.
I'll put that back in now.
You just tell me.
Yep.
I'm just putting
888.
888-910-0416.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's
Well,
great.
thank you, everybody.
Thank you. How do you
Okay,
join
yeah,
NAMI?
get outside and join the afternoon. Oh, we have a question about joining NAMI.
Yeah. Or
Uh,
becoming a member? I'd like to become a member.
Well, we would love to have you. If we can do one of two things, we can mail you an application, or we can
Email you an
email one too.
application.
So if you either share your email with us just verbally or put it in the chat there, we'd be happy to send one off to you, Janet. Thank you.
I'm not so